from Imagine Your Goddess, and for the fifth time probably this week, maybe more, I am bringing you a deck profile. This profile should air on Friday, along with the release of the new set, and this is my Alucard Mono Black Dracula build. Now this is not updated to the MOA format, or the Vingolf for that matter. I brought that to you intentionally because I kind of want to get you guys thinking inside of correcting, and so I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to make changes to this deck, but I will let you know that changes are made. First thing is, of course, Alucard. Alucard can tap to do 0-3 to something, and it can also J-activate for 0 when you have a Vampire Resonator and something goes from your opponent's field to the graveyard this turn. Alucard is a 1,000 flying imperishable ruler, J-ruler, and his ability is when a Resonator is dealt damage to him, dies this turn, it becomes yours and becomes a vampire. He is a really strong ruler, and he's often very overlooked, I think, mostly because Black has Abdul, and people think that Abdul has to be run, and therefore you cannot run anything else. But a strong vampire build can overtake Abdul in very critical situations, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So, without further ado, let's get into the Resonators. I play 4 copies of Servant of Vampire. Servant of Vampire is a 200/200 1-drop that says when an opponent's card would target a vampire, it has to target him first instead. So understand that unlike the new Christie, he does not create a lock on the field. So if you have 2 of these on board, your opponent can target either one for the purposes of spells or abilities. So it's something to keep in mind, but other than that, he's good at drawing out your opponent's thunders and whatnot, because they have to kill him before they work on the bigger stuff. Then I run 4 copies of Laura the Bloodspeaker, 3/3 vampire for 1, that when it enters the battlefield, you can search your deck for a vampire and put it in your hand. This is how you get a hold of the sheer number of creatures that you want to grab out. This card is really good for like Cinderella fodder, and it's also it's a steady creature. When it gets up to 5/5 or 7/7, your opponent has to deal with it, even though it's a vanilla effect after it's hit the board, so it's worthwhile. 2 copies of Cinderella the Ashen Maiden. This is one of the more popular cards of the set. Costs 2 black to bring out. It's a 4/4, and its ability is whenever you can banish a Resonator to deal 200 damage to each Resonator your opponent controls. It also has an effect involving princes, but I don't use that effect at all. Basically, what the activate ability does for you, and pretty much the sole purpose why this is in deck, is to deal with nasty Mephistopheles that you can't target or deal with. So you have your ruler up, maybe he's a 12 or 14 because of Alvarez's, and then you use Cinderella's ability to sack, give everything on your opponent's side 200 damage, gets rid of those cats that he can chump block with, gets rid of the Gretels that they can chump block with, and it does a couple hundred damage to Mephistopheles so that you can finally overcome him and then take him because of Dracula's pet. I run 4 copies of Vampire Bat. He is a 0-200 flying, and Magic players know the term lifelink. That means whatever damage he deals, you gain that much life. And he costs 1 and a black. You can also pay a black as an activated ability to give him +2/+0 until end of turn. Now this might not seem like much, but when you are dealing with holding back mana for turns at a time, if you have 5 mana on the board untapped and you go into your draw step, you can pay for his ability 5 times, giving him 1,000 power, and then untap all your mana, having things ready to deal with your opponent's stuff when you attack with your 1,200. And being able to gain that much life is usually a nail in the coffin for your opponent, because Most decks only work to deal with 4,000. Another life gainer in the deck is 4 copies of Vampire Staff. Vampire Staff's ability is at the beginning of your recovery phase. That's right before you unrest everything or untap, depending on if you're a Magic player or not. You flip the top card of your deck, and then you gain 100 life for each symbol will on a card, and your opponent loses that much. So with a card like her flipping up, it would be 100. Sometimes it's up to 3, but you rarely see more than 300 or 400. But the fact that you can do it just adds a couple more turns to your clock, and it lowers your opponent's clock by a turn or two. So nothing bad. I run 1 copy of Seth. I know Seth is human. I know he has white, and he's the only card in the main deck that has white. But his ability is too big to ignore. His continuous ability is that whenever your opponent discards a card, you get to draw a card. And whenever your opponent's creatures go from the field to the graveyard, you get to pull a resonator from your graveyard to your hand. His ability stays on the stack during an explosion. So if you use Awakening at the end to do -7/-7 to all resonators, your opponent has 4 creatures on the board, say, and you have Seth, you're going to get to pull 4 cards back from the graveyard with it, and one of those cards can be Seth. This is the way the current rulings rule it, and until it's different, I say we abuse it as much as we can. We have 3 copies of Pumpkin Witch. Pumpkin Witch is a 300/800, and when it enters the field, all resonators that you control gain swiftness and flying until end of turn. This is a game ender. This is the way that you make sure that your last attack is powerful enough and unstoppable enough to get around them. Now, sometimes you won't even get to this card, but in a lot of cases, what happens with aggro decks is your opponent ends up at 300 or 400 life, and then they control the board forever, for the rest of forever. And you don't have that kind of choice here, so what you do is you flip this onto the board when you have 4 or 5 creatures left on board, and you swing with everything and try to get around those last little bit of hit points. Finally, for resonators, I run 2 copies of Camilla. Camilla is 4 cost, 2 and 2 black. It's a little expensive for me, hence why I only run 2. But her ability is she destroys target non-vampire resonator, and if you control Alucard and it's a human, you gain control of it. It loses human and becomes vampire. That's another way just to control things, just like you do with Dracula. I like it in there, but again, like Laura searches it out, you have a lot of ways to get the cards you want in this game, so it's not really necessary to run a 4 of, and I feel like if you do, you're gumming up the works, so that's my personal feelings on it. That is my resonator pull for the main deck. For non-resonators, I have 4 copies of Slippers of Cinderella. Slippers of Cinderella gives -4/-4 to a creature. It's an addition, it costs 1 black. Unless that creature is black and has a base power of 400/400, in which case it gives +6/+6. Cinderella, obviously, is a 4/4 that's darkness, but so is Vampire Staff, King in Yellow, and if you run these cards alongside it, you have a bunch of different creatures that you can just turn into a 1,000 powerhouse. So I like running 4 Cinderellas. They also are a really cheap, effective kill so that you can flip that Dracula. I run 4 copies of Alvarez, the Demon's Castle. It's a 1 and a black edition, field edition, and when it's on the field, all vampires you control get +2/+2, and that includes Dracula. Also, you may pay a black and banish the card in order to get a vampire from your graveyard back into your hand. This is a good way to replenish your field after your opponent's done some sick board wipes or sick combos. But the main reason it's there is to give Alucard or Dracula that little something extra in order to win the game. For Stoning to Death, I'm playing black, so I run Stoning to Death in 4 of. Don't see that as a problem. Then I run 4 copies of Bloodsucking Impulse. Bloodsucking Impulse is an instant for 1 and a black, and it says target vampire you control deals damage equal to its attack to another target resonator. Then you gain life equal to half that much damage, rounded up to the nearest 100. So with just having Dracula on board, paying 1 and a black at instant speed deals 1,000 damage to target resonator, and you gain 500 life. And since he's considered doing the damage, if they die because of it, or they die anytime during the turn, you get that card because of Alucard's effect. This is a very, very strong way of dealing with creatures that you would not normally be able to overcome. It also gives you a little oomph when you're fighting against things that even Dracula can't overcome. So you block with your Dracula, your opponent's swinging with their Mephistopheles, they're like, great, I got rid of Dracula. Then you play one of these, 1,000 damage, then they take 2,000 damage. Your Dracula will flip back to Alucard, but you will still get their Mephistopheles, gain 500 life, and have gotten rid of a Mephistopheles on their side of the board. It's kind of a big deal. Stones. I run 4 of the black-white stone, and the rest are plain darkness stones. The reason why I run it this way is because my sideboard sides a little bit into white, and I have the 1 Seth in board. It also kind of throws your opponent off because it gives them an idea that you're running more white than you are, and so they start preparing for white, in which case you can just pound them with the mono black. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about my sideboard. Now, this isn't the sideboard that I would run in Perfect, but there are a few things about it that I like. One of the cards of my sideboard is Pandora of Light. I know that most people would say run Pandora of Dark, and I have no issue with you running both if you so choose. But I run Pandora of Light as an alternate ruler because I like being able to blow up big creatures. And she allows me to make up for the shortcomings that my deck has as far as creature kill is concerned. I also like running an alternate as Ebony Prophet / Abdul Al-Hazred. Abdul is one of those cards that you'd be foolish not to play if you needed it. But usually the deck tends to run on more of an aggro stance where you flip Dracula on turn 2 or 3 and then just go at them with a flying clock that they can't deal with. If you are running up against a deck that you need the control against, Ebony Prophet's the way to go. Because I run Ebony Prophet in the sideboard, I also run Grubalesta in the sideboard. It's just one of those things that happens. I run 3 copies of Yellow Sign in the sideboard. Yellow Sign is a really overlooked card. It's an addition that gives a -3/-3 to the added creature. It also deals 300 damage to the Resonator's controller between each turn. That's your turn and their turn. So if you get 2 of these on board and your opponent, say on turn 3, you put 2 of them on board on 2 different creatures, not only have you weakened their creature significantly, but now you're doing 600 damage to them in between each turn. And you've already done 300 on turn 2. So 300, 300, 600 is already done, 1200 is done when you pass with 2 on board. You're already adding damage to the clock. This card almost always gets sideboarded in against decks that don't run Shroud or non-targeted creatures. So if you know that you're going up against somebody who's not running that many Cheshires or not running an Aesop ability, that ends up going in. It also adds more kill to the deck should you need it. My sideboard runs 1 copy of Mephistopheles. Mephistopheles is a flyer and a target attacker, 15/15 he costs 4. If your opponent wants to target him, they have to lose 500 life to do it. And at the end of your turn, you have to sacrifice a Resonator other than him. Mephistopheles is a really powerful card, works really well with Abdul, and it works really good, just kind of across the board. I don't run it main board because it's not a vampire. And with how much my deck focuses on vampires, it's kind of important that he's not a vampire, hence why he's not played. I run 2 copies of Awakening at the End in my sideboard. It's 2 and 2 black, and all resonators gain -7 until end of turn. This is a really good way to deal with dragon decks that get a bunch of stuff on board really fast, or grim aggro decks that just try to hit you with tiny creatures all the way through. You play this and you wipe the board and then make them have to work all over again to get it started. And since they don't run a ton of stuff that revives or bounces, you're usually pretty golden. Also, it's a double-edged sword. It does kill your own guys, but that's why the main board runs 1 Seth, and the sideboard has 2 more. Seth is just an all-around good card. Since I'm splashing white, I might as well. I might run 4 in here in a perfect world, but I wasn't quite sure on ratios when I built my sideboard, so I just kind of built what I built. My sideboard also has 4 copies of Spiral of Despair. Now, a lot of people think that I will just only throw in Spiral of Despair when I throw in Pandora, but that's not true. Spiral of Despair is a really good discard card regardless of whether or not you're playing Pandora. Pandora makes it good because it forces your opponent to discard randomly. If you don't know what it does, it's 2 black. Your opponent must discard 2 cards, and if your J ruler is Pandora, then they discard those cards at random. But having them discard at random is not necessarily any better than just making them discard, depending on how good their hand is. Because a lot of times your opponent only holds stuff in their hand because they think it's going to help them in the long run. So if you push through their hand and make them discard, that forces them to play a little more aggressively with the stuff that they want to play, and it causes the burnout to work really well. So I've talked about burning out your opponent, and I'll kind of talk about what I do with this deck in the last couple seconds here. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm running 4 copies of everything important and a bunch more creatures than non-creatures. My goal is to kind of flood out my opponent's ability to deal with stuff and chip away at their life points one way or another. The first way is to flip Alucard as quickly as possible. The best way to do that is you make a stone turn 1 and you play a Servant of Vampire, and then on turn 2, if they put down a creature, you slippers and you flip them immediately. You have a turn 2 Dracula, just go to town. Other than that, you can always wait until turn 3 or 4 after you get a few stones and a few answers going, and then you can flip Alucard with Camilla or Stoning to Death or Slippers or anything you want, and start draining away at your opponent with the sheer number of answers you have to any creatures they might play. Your opponent will keep trying to cancel out your stuff, hence why everything's 4-ofs, and there are multiple recursion techniques. Even with the sheer amount of counters that Scheherazade Control or Abdul Control has in play, it's still really hard to deal with 4 copies of Vampire Bat, 2 copies of Camilla, and 4 copies of Laura, letting me search whatever I want. So you play these things like Laura, your opponent goes, oh, okay, I'll let him search, and then cancel the thing he wants to play. And then you play a Serpent of Vampire with it, maybe, and they're like, well, obviously he wants it on the board, so I'm going to stop him. It's all about kind of draining all those resources from your opponent. That way, when the time comes and you're ready to play your endgame pumpkin witches, you can play them and your opponent can't do anything about it. And you've already done a few 100,000 damage with Dracula, and hopefully you're just done. There are other techniques and other ways of going about it. There are certainly some cards that will be changing with Moa, but the general deck idea will be the same. So that's this deck. I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you guys give it a shot. I know that it's hard in the Force of Will community to try something that isn't a guaranteed win, but I think once you start looking outside of the meta, you can find that there's a lot of fun stuff to play that can be just as functional as any deck built online. Alright, well, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll show you guys some more videos, and I'll talk to you soon. Diesel out.